Wow, I'm so honored to see so many of my favorite people in the city here. Thank you for coming out on a chilly night. I've been asked to confine my remarks to the past. I have a lot to say about the present, but I'm trying. Okay, history is what hurts. In times of crisis, we look to the past to examine its lessons for how we might go forward. And what we find is a deep history of various protracted freedom struggles and various protracted responses to limit these freedom struggles. Tonight I'll be focusing on immigration enforcement. And I want to start with the fugitive slave law, passed in the late 18th and 19th century to limit the mobility of African Americans, to insist that constabulary in northern cities cooperate with slave catchers to make vulnerable any Black person in a northern city, regardless of the conditions of their birth, whether they were an escaped slave or freeborn, to render them vulnerable to slave enslavement. Responding to this, abolitionists, Black and white, evolved a practice of accompaniment and sanctuary, meant to accompany these folks into court, meant to hide them from their vulnerability. There are obvious parallels to our current moment. Critical legal scholar Mari Matsuda, the granddaughter of the undocumented writer Paul Kochi, writes, "The pattern of our arrival, coinciding with violence against African Americans, is perhaps not coincidental. For immigration is stimulated by international instability and domestic economic change, both creating status anxiety that easily erupts into violence." Act 1, birthright citizenship. African Americans in this country agitated for freedom before, during, and after slavery, before and after the Civil War. They were aware during and after the Civil War that emancipation would not be enough and that there had to be an enduring, powerful protection for Black citizenship subsequent to emancipation. This is a picture of the colored conventions which convened in northern cities during this period. The 14th Amendment, passed 10 years after emancipation because it was controversial, says this in Section 1. "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of its laws." Radical words for the time. These are tested in 1898, when a Chinese-American man named Wong Kim Ark, who was born in California and educated as was very common for the time back in China, decides to come back to the United States. It's after 1888 when the Chinese Exclusion Act has passed, and he's told at Angel Island that he cannot enter because he's Chinese, and he says, "Oh no, I'm American." This case eventually goes to the Supreme Court, which wrestles for a long time 9 white men, because nobody meant for the 14th Amendment to mean that there could be such a thing as an Asian American. However, Wong Kim Ark wins his case. It's important that the 14th Amendment says this, that there's an exception for 1, foreign diplomats, or 2, the child born to parents who are nationals of an enemy nation that is engaged in a hostile occupation of the country's territory. These are the only exceptions. During the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II, the attempt to strip American-born Japanese of their citizenship went all the way to the Supreme Court, which affirmed that even though they were nationals of a country, they were ethnically descended from a country with whom we were at war, their citizenship was intact. Obvious current applications. Act 2, learning from the banana. Around the time Wong Kim Ark was suing for his citizenship, the United States, having finished dispossessing the indigenous inhabitants of the continental United States and prevailing over them by law and warfare, began to expand its territories abroad. Initially to the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. We acquired territories and we began to occupy territories through economic practices, The greatest example of these to me is United Fruit, which began to have plantations in Central America and the Caribbean. The term Banana Republic was initially used to describe the nation of Honduras, where many plantations like the one pictured here existed. It is important to say that the occupants of these plantations and the occupants of the newly acquired territories of the US did not have full citizenship rights. So it was possible for Americans to eat bananas from all over the world, to travel on the Great White Fleet, I'm not making that up, on the Great White Fleet all over the world to view the tropical places where bananas were grown, but it was not possible for people from those tropical plantations to flee to better their lives, or they weren't allowed by law. Act 3, refugees. People move. It's an act of migrant refusal. So, for example, the Haitians in United States-backed authoritarian regimes under Papa Doc and Baby Doc Duvalier began leaving Haiti in 1963 and pushing to be seen as refugees in this country. Now, typically we tend to see refugees as people who are leaving only countries that we are unfriendly to. It's also very important to see this as a post-civil rights moment. So the Haitian refugee crisis, 1963 to about 1980, or continuously if you want since then. At the same time that Black citizens are pressing for their civil rights, Haitians are pressing for refugee rights and early on achieved some traction, but the move to strip Haitians of their rights is a post-civil rights move. It's a pushback against civil rights. So we have the advent of mass detention starting around the Haitians. This is Chrome Avenue Detention Center, which starts as a response to Haitian migration in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and is still open today as a way to detain people who are petitioning for their rights as refugees to claim asylum. At the same time, in the 1980s, Central Americans from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and other countries are leaving their countries because of the instability caused by then almost 80 or 90 years of US occupation, support for authoritarian governments, and then the dirty wars which were fought in the 70s and 80s. A dirty war is a war fought by military or security personnel against an insurgency which incurs very high civilian casualties because very often the military and security personnel suspect everyone of being insurgency. So hundreds of thousands of people flee Central America, heading north in the 1970s and 80s. Almost none of them are granted refugee status. They're seen as economic migrants. So in the 1980s, it starts in the churches a notion of sanctuary, which harkens back in some ways to the abolitionists with whom I began. But the idea that churches should use their space to offer sanctuary to those fleeing repression, danger, and death in Central America who are continually not acknowledged by the regime here as people deserving of refuge and shelter. The sanctuary movement of the 1980s gains traction in churches, temples, and mosques, cities and states. It becomes a fairly widespread movement. The pushback is in the slide on your right. So in the early 1990s, Republican politicians start to link sanctuary, which is a nice word, right? If you go to church or temple or mosque, you might have a period of your service where you talk about sanctuary. It's a spiritual word, it's a sweet word. However, in the early 1990s, politicians began to demonize sanctuary as a place of crime, a place of danger, and to link immigration with crime and danger. So when you say sanctuary city now, depending on what quarters you're in, it can be a very controversial word. CODA, Sanctuary Campus. We exist in a time of protracted danger and vulnerability for many, many people. Our campuses are public spaces where we come together on evenings like this to share ideas, to welcome one another, regardless of race or ethnicity or nationality. It's very clear in the current regime that these spaces are going to become more and more dangerous for foreign-born students, for transgender people, for people of color. The response that we have, the response that is given to us by history, starting with the abolition movement, continuing throughout history, is to find ways to take care of and shelter one another. Sanctuary campus is something being enacted around the country. Provisions for, and all of you who teach here, take this to heart. What would you do? What are you supposed to do if the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency shows up at your classroom door with a warrant? Do you know what your rights are? Do you know if you have to turn over a student? Sanctuary campus would say, we're going to give you trainings, we're going to give you people to send those ICE people to. We need something in effect on our campus. We have no policies for this now, and we need one.